So far we've looked at quite a lot of theoretical stuff as we've unpacked some initial ideas around Yiquan's logical model. And I hope some people have noticed that I've tried to choose images to go with the discussion that demonstrate visually what I'm saying conceptually. So even if you don't resonate so much with the theory, you can watch the images and see physically the concepts that I'm talking about. But nothing beats practical training, so to explore the rest of the logical model, I want to move on now into more practical training. That's going to take a little bit of setting up theoretically, that's inevitable, but I want to start talking about Yiquan's natural set. And like everything in Yiquan, the natural set isn't a fixed thing, but we can say in essence that it's the logical next step. Once we combine everything that we've been talking about in the beginner series, in this series, all the quintessence principles of Wushu, everything that we've been thinking about and practicing, they all come together, and then when they take the next step, they emerge into a set of basic movements. That's not the movements that are on the screen at the moment, by the way. That's just filling in a bit of space while I talk. And the natural set is called that not because it attempts to mimic things from nature, but because it's an extension of the laws of physics when combined with a human physiology. Human physiology on average, and then human physiologies in particular, because everyone's different, so everyone's expression of the natural set will be different. And obviously one of our quintessence principles of Wushu is that we are thinking about martial arts, so these movements are fight-based movements. They're basic martial arts movements that form into a set of postures that we can use for that practical purpose. But of course, in Yiquan, nothing's ever quite that simple. Everything's always contradictory. So we can say that the natural set isn't really natural in the sense of it being innate. And I think that's a source of a lot of confusion. It's human potential put through the lens of culture. And culture in this case, the culture of martial arts, the quintessence principles of Chinese Wushu, and then any other aspects of cultural practice, things that we've learned about martial arts. As the saying goes in Yiquan, if someone else has got something good, we want it. So the natural set is a culturally informed expression of innate human potential. And as Yao Zongzun put it very succinctly, Yiquan should be based on natural principles but be adapted to specific needs. In any case, we can think of the natural set a little bit like in other martial arts where you have a set of basic forms for beginners and then you move up into increasingly complex forms as you move through the ranks or the system. But again, Yiquan is always highly contradictory, so when we say basic postures in this sense, we don't mean easy postures in the way that would be meant in other martial arts systems. In fact, the simpler the posture, very often the harder it is. So the very simplest postures of all in the natural set are just basic movements of the feet. So release force in very small foot movements. That's incredibly difficult to do and requires an enormous amount of finesse. And for that reason, even though we could say that those are the most elementary postures, I'm not going to start there because it requires so much skill to do them, but I'll come to that in a moment. And also, unlike other systems, there's no real point where you can say that the natural set ends and the next set of postures begins. It's a continuum, and that continuum is also linked into another key idea, the idea of cultivation. And to keep that as simple as possible right now, we'll just say that we want to think about one key idea from the quintessence principles of Wushu, and that's the idea that you should make the movement as small as possible for the most power possible. So that seems like a very fixed thing, like there's just a technique where you get a certain amount of skill, and a lot of the people who are cheating the people with fake versions of Yiquan sell this idea that there's some kind of skill that you can develop that will just somehow give you an immense amount of force for a ridiculously small movement. That's not what this means. There's a limit. In the most ideal, perfect movement skill, there's a maximum amount of kinetic force that you could generate. If you've got your posture absolutely perfect in every singular degree, that's your maximum amount of power that you could generate. And so working towards making postures smaller so that you can keep generating at least the same amount of power is about continually refining your body movement. And one of the key ways that we do that, of course, is through standing, because that causes the whole posture to relax and then begin to reset and rejoin together and to function in a much more efficient manner. It's a shame really how many people are still lost in miles of fog trying to work out what standing does, when it's actually such a simple thing, such a simple concept, and it works so easily. Such a fantastic training method. And that process, guided by this idea of working towards making postures smaller and smaller, which is another way of saying making your overall movements more efficient, well, that's a process over time, and that's what we call cultivation. And I think this gets a little bit misunderstood because everyone likes to do big movements when they're doing Jamwoo and Shili. That's the best way to play with those forces. But for superior cultivation, you've got to make the movements then smaller and smaller again. So you go from standing to expanding into big movements, then back into smaller movements. And you can see that the further you go back into the past, the Yiquan masters have bigger punches, they have bigger movements, whereas in modern Yiquan we try to make those movements much smaller. And a key characteristic of that is the use of centrifugal force, because centrifugal force is the easiest way for the body to maximise the laws of physics. And for this reason, the movements of the natural set are very much the types of movements that we see on the walls of the Shaolin temple in those very famous frescoes. Very simple movements using centrifugal force, hitting with the limbs, i.e. big swinging limb hits rather than hitting in with a fist, hitting in with the forearm, or very simple kicks. These are the types of things that we see drawn in the frescoes at Shaolin. And of course Wang Xiangjai trained there for a few months with Shi Henglin, who was a real monk, by the way, and there's real documentary evidence that he existed. And he trained there, and for Wang Xiangjai, Shaolin was the origin of Yiquan, Damo was the origin of Yiquan, and these very simple kinds of natural expressions of the laws of physics that we see in that early Shaolin Chuan, they would be the kind of thing that Damo was teaching. So, for example, the first posture that we want to look at in terms of the natural set, we have looked at things from it before, but for this set of videos, the first thing that we want to look at is the inside forearm strike with the lead arm. So lead forearm strike, or what is sometimes called a clothesline strike. That's quite hard to say with my accent. A clothesline strike. But remember, simple doesn't mean easy, it just means not fussy. It's not a fussy movement. So anyway, if we take me as an example, and excusing the video quality, if I demonstrate the posture, my cultivation is not so bad. So this is the kind of thing that, from Wang Xiangjai's perspective, the original Shaolin monks who were learning from Damo, this is the kind of thing that they would be working on. Unfussy movements using whole body unified force. But then gradually, over time, over decades and centuries, they lost track of the fifth context. So they lost whole body unified force, and the fifth context changed in Shaolin. They changed it to muscular strength. And to compensate for that loss, they then exaggerated the other four contexts to their extremes. So this kind of posture is the kind of thing that you might see in traditional wushu, a very low posture, very big swing of the arms to maximise centrifugal force, and a massive exaggeration of the four contexts, open, close, rise and sink, within Shaolin postures and Shaolin derived postures. And you can see from that how traditional wushu begins to develop. Eventually adding in dramatic jumps, movements, spins, to try and generate as much force as possible without whole body unified force by using these massive exaggerations of the other four contexts, the other four elements. But just as it gets lost in one direction, so it can be found again, and that's what happens with Wang Shanjai. So a good example is thinking, again, with the forearm strike, you can step by step reclaim it. So early each one, they start thinking, well, you want to maximize centrifugal force, so you use a huge posture, you swing the other arm right back. But step by step, you start making the posture smaller, the cultivation gets higher. And ironically, you start bringing in this little Shaolin posture, the curtailed arm as you swing out the forearm and you pull that arm back with screwing force, is exactly the kind of posture you see in Shaolin Chuan. In any case, the use of this kind of natural set in early Shaolin and in the early stages of the modern iteration of Yiquan relies very much on centrifugal force, because centrifugal force is a much simpler way of using our whole body unified force. It still requires sophisticated cultivation, but nevertheless they are much less fussy postures and they suggest themselves much more naturally. And think about, in the modern world, someone who gets into a fight and they've got no training and they throw a haymaker, because on some instinctive level, or maybe with a little bit of cultural exposure, you kind of know that a haymaker really maximizes centrifugal force. But a jab is a significantly more sophisticated posture. And what's the difference? Well, a jab transmits force in a completely different way. It maximizes force, but it requires a lot more sophistication in the movement. And we can demonstrate at least a part of this principle very easily by saying, if you poke someone with a stick, you can transmit much more force, do much more damage than if you hit them with the side of the stick with exactly the same amount of energy. A part of that, of course, is the hit point. So the point that strikes the target is able to transmit more force, just like a fist is able to transmit more force because it's solid, because it's a solid structure and the force can go directly into the knuckles. Whereas if we swing in with the forearm, actually that doesn't transmit force anywhere near as efficiently. It's exactly the same principle. So for the poke with the stick, just like the jab, we can transmit more force than we can if we use exactly the same amount of force to do a hook or a haymaker. And just for the ease of language use and discussion, we use these two terms, bone alignment and muscle alignment. And by bone alignment, we mean what we do when we throw a jab, and by muscle alignment, we mean what we do when we throw a hook.